Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a copy of the sermon notes, and if you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would probably suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, then I would encourage you to pause the playback, get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the video. Has there ever been a time in your life when you met someone really famous? Has that ever happened to you? I wish that I could hear some feedback from you right now, because what I've found is that most people, when you ask them that question, they will tell you, yeah, I met so-and-so, and they'll tell you all about it, and it always kind of lights up their eyes, and there's some excitement about this time they met a famous person. I can tell you that over the course of my life, I have met a few famous people. When I was in high school, I actually met Charlton Heston very briefly. For some reason, Charlton Heston was coming and giving a speech from our high school in Albuquerque. And it just so happened that as I was leaving and getting ready to walk home, I was leaving school late for some reason, probably because I got held after school in detention or something like that, but I was heading home, and I just happened to be walking out right as Charlton Heston and his entourage were walking in. And I was young and dumb and didn't know any better, so I just walked right up to Charlton Heston, and I shook his hand, and I got his autograph. So that was kind of fun. I can also tell you that when I was in my mid-20s, when I was an associate pastor in Southern Nevada, I officiated a wedding at a house where one of the wedding guests was TV's Kelsey Grammer. As in Frasier, you remember Frasier from Cheers and from the TV show called Frasier. He was at a wedding that I officiated. There's actually a story there, and I don't really have time to tell it right now. I probably shouldn't put the story out there on the internet for everyone to hear. If you're really interested, then feel free to ask me about it next time you see me in person. And I also have to, and does it sound like I'm bragging? I promise I'm not trying to brag. I really am not. But I can also tell you that when I was working for Back to the Bible, which is a radio ministry based here in Lincoln, Nebraska, when I was working for them a couple of decades ago, I did a Christian radio program, a little 60-second program called Solid Sounds, in which we would go and we would interview Christian recording artists. And so I had the incredible privilege of meeting and interviewing folks like Michael W. Smith and Stephen Curtis Chapman and Chris Tomlin and Third Day and Mercy Me. And the list goes on and on and on. But maybe the artist that I was the most excited about was Jars of Clay. Jars of Clay is one of my favorite artists of all time. One of my top 5 artists of any genre of all time. And so when I had the privilege of meeting their lead singer, Dan Hasseltine, and interviewing him, I was kind of starstruck. And so, again, I don't know if you've had that experience, and I don't know if you've ever been starstruck. When you're starstruck, you're fumbling over words, and you are having trouble just trying to get out a coherent thought. And when you're interviewing someone, you have to get out words because they're literally going to be played back on the air. Or you have to be able to put together some coherent thoughts in order to ask good questions. So at some point when I was doing these interviews for Solid Sounds, I got over the hump and I got past being starstruck, but I still remember what an incredible blast that was. So thankful that I had that opportunity with Back to the Bible many years ago. So thankful that they hired me and that they assigned me to that little Christian music program called Solid Sounds. Anyway, the reason that I bring all of that up is because in our lectionary gospel reading for this coming Sunday, February 19th of 2023, our friends, the disciples, it seems like they get a little starstruck. Actually, they get a lot starstruck. This coming Sunday, February 19th of 2023, is Transfiguration Sunday. So it makes logical sense that the lectionary passage isn't going to pick up where we left off last week. You might recall that the last 3 weeks in a row, we were taking a look at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, Transfiguration Sunday, we're going to take a look at the Transfiguration. And the Transfiguration is recorded in 3 of the Gospels. It's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to take a look at the account from Matthew. This is Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While Peter was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified, but Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." May God bless the reading of the fascinating and inspiring word. So this is, in my humble opinion, one of the most interesting passages in all of the Gospels. There's sort of an air of mystery to this. There aren't a lot of passages from the Gospels where you read them and afterwards you go, wow, that was really kind of out there. That was really kind of hard to understand. But I think the Transfiguration, at least to me, is one of those passages that's a little bit hard to understand. What I'd like to do is what we always do. I'd like to talk through the passage. I want to put a little bit finer point on a number of the verses in this passage. And then what we'll do is we will focus on 3 of the lessons that I think this passage has for us. So, at the start of the passage, it tells us that Jesus is taking not all 12 disciples with him. In this case, he's taking his inner circle from the disciples. He's taking Peter, James, and John. We know that a number of times in the Gospels that Jesus goes to special, I guess you'd call it special occasions, or he goes for special moments, and he just takes these 3, the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. In this case, they go up on a high mountain, the 4 of them, and Jesus is changed. He's transfigured. It says that his face shines as bright as the sun, his clothes shine as white as light. I think one of the parallel accounts says as white as lightning. And it says, then there appears before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Now, I think to us, we go, that's interesting that Moses and Elijah all of a sudden appear there with Jesus. And you see Peter's reaction to the appearance of Moses and Elijah. It seems like he's a little bit starstruck. Peter says, "Oh, wow, this is amazing. Hey, you know what? Let's put up some tents. One for you, Jesus, and let's put up another tent for Moses, and let's put up another tent for Elijah." The implication being, we want Moses and Elijah to stick around with us for a while. This is pretty cool. Now, I want to share with you that from one of the parallel accounts, I believe it's the parallel account from Luke, and maybe even it's in not only the parallel account in Luke, but maybe in the parallel account in Mark as well, where the authors of those Gospels tell us parenthetically that Peter didn't know what he was talking about. Basically, that he was babbling. He was starstruck. He didn't even know what he was saying at this point. In this case, Matthew doesn't throw Peter under the bus like that, but he does tell us, as the other parallel accounts of the Transfiguration tell us as well, that suddenly there is this bright cloud that appears and envelops them. And there is a voice that comes from the cloud, and clearly the voice is the voice of God. And the voice says, "This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And it says that Peter and James and John, when they hear the voice of God, that they fall flat on the ground, face down. They are terrified. And one of the things that we have to remind ourselves is that in that culture, thousands of years ago, there was a commonly held belief, and we see this in the Old Testament, we see this in the New Testament, that if you saw God with your own eyes, that you would die. And so that is probably why Peter and James and John are terrified and why they literally have their faces to the ground. If God's speaking, then God's there. They don't want to see God. They don't want to die. And then Jesus comes and he taps them on the shoulders and he says, all right, guys, get up. He says, you don't have to be afraid. And they get up and they realize that Elijah and Moses have disappeared. Now it's just the four of them once again. And as they're coming down the mountain, Jesus says to them, hey, don't tell anybody what's happened until Jesus says the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Now, if you've watched these sermons before, anytime we come across that three-word term, Son of Man, I have always told you to remember that Son of Man equals what? Son of Man equals Messiah. So Jesus says to him, don't tell anybody what happened here until the Messiah has been raised from the dead. Of course, talking about himself. Now, again, this is interesting. There is almost an air of mystery. This is a very supernatural event. And so, first of all, before we get into the practical lessons for us as disciples, I want to talk about what happened here in the bigger picture. This is Matthew 17. And at this point, Jesus and the disciples have been together for, most scholars estimate at least a season or two, maybe several years at this point, that Jesus has been with the disciples. They have been traveling and they have been performing ministry together. At this point, we know that they have an inkling, at least an inkling, that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. That all Hebrew people, including them, Peter, James, and John, that this may be the Messiah that they've been waiting for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But what's the significance of Moses and Elijah appearing? Well, it's actually very important and very significant. And here's why. I've always said to you, remember that anytime you see that three-word phrase, Son of Man, you have to remember that Son of Man equals Messiah. I think I've talked to you very recently about the fact anytime you see the five-word phrase, the law and the prophets, that you need to say to yourself, the law and the prophets, that equals what? That equals the Old Testament. Well, as far as Peter, James, and John, and all of their Hebrew contemporaries would have been concerned 2,000 years ago, the person who represented the law, well, that would be Moses. Because Moses was, of course, the one who retrieved the Ten Commandments, broke them, and retrieved them a second time. Moses is the one who they credited with writing the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the law. So Moses equals the law. And then we have Elijah, who, as far as the Hebrew people 2,000 years ago, people like Peter, James, and John would have been concerned that of the many prophets that they had in the Old Testament, they would have considered Elijah to be the greatest of those prophets. So Moses equals the law, Elijah equals the prophets. So what do we have when the two of them are together? Well, we have the two ultimate representatives of the Old Testament. So if the two ultimate representatives of the Old Testament suddenly just show up with Jesus, then what are we seeing here? Well, even though the text doesn't spell it out for us, it should be pretty plain to us in a symbolic sense that this is a symbolic passing of the baton from Moses representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets, the two of them together representing the Old Testament, the two of them together representing the Old Covenant, and now they're passing the baton to Jesus, who's going to usher in the New Covenant. So that is what's happening here with the Transfiguration. So maybe, hopefully, that helps us, me included, hopefully that helps us to understand this kind of mysterious event a little better. What I want to do now, fairly quickly, is I want us to focus on 3 of the lessons that this passage has for us. By my count, this is a fairly straightforward passage. You might recall last week I was complaining about there's no way that we could possibly get through our lectionary passage last week. There was just way too much material there. This is a fairly straightforward story. By my count, in this story, there are 3, maybe 4, but we'll say 3 instructions that are given in this passage to the disciples. And so we're going to focus on those 3 instructions. And we're going to apply them not just to those disciples, Peter, James, and John, we're going to apply them to us as well. The first instruction was this: as disciples, we should be listening to Jesus. As disciples, we should be listening to Jesus in this passage when God speaks to them from the cloud, which, by the way, there are only 3 times in the Gospels in which God speaks. Another one is when Jesus is baptized. You remember that? When Jesus was baptized, God spoke. And there's another time where Jesus is just simply teaching the disciples. And basically, Jesus says, God, may thy name be glorified. And God says, it will be glorified, and it will be glorified again. I'm paraphrasing there, but basically that's what it says. And so this is one of only 3 times where God speaks. And God says, this is my son whom I love. I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Says to Peter, James, and John, listen to this guy, to my son, to Jesus. And just as Peter, James, and John, we know, took those words to heart to the best of their ability, we need to take those words to heart, you and I, and all followers of Jesus Christ in the year 2023. Just as all followers of Jesus Christ that came the generations before us, just as all followers of Jesus Christ in the generations after us, we should all take those words to heart. And I've talked about this before. Look, when Jesus is talking about blessed are the meek, and blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are the pure in heart, it's easy for us to listen to those words because those words they're easy to wrap our heads around. When Jesus says, we are the salt of the earth, that we are the light of the world, that's pretty easy to listen to. On the other hand, last week, when Jesus really, really stepped on our toes, that isn't as easy, is it? But you know what? It's not a pick or choose deal. We have to listen to all of Jesus' words. And so, friends, I want to encourage you, as I encourage myself, to make sure that we are following all of Jesus' words, that we are listening to Jesus, and that we're following all of his instructions. So that is the first lesson. The second instruction, the second lesson we should take from the passage is this: as disciples, we shouldn't be paralyzed by fear. As disciples, we shouldn't be paralyzed by fear. So the first instruction that was given to the disciples was from God, was from the voice from the cloud that said, listen to my son, listen to Jesus. The second instruction comes from Jesus. When Jesus sees them lying face down with their heads buried in the sand so they don't see God, so they don't die, Jesus goes up to him, taps him on the shoulder and says, get up, don't be afraid. And look, friends, in the world that we live in today, there are plenty of things I think that we have to be afraid of. Over the past several years, there has been this worldwide pandemic going on, and there have been, well over a million lives lost to this pandemic. I'm sorry, that's not a laughing matter. I'm just laughing at me tripping over my own words. But friends, I mean, that's something that I think has caused people fear. You think about the other violence that happens in the world around us. And I'm sure that there are people who live in fear, and rightfully so. I mean, think about our brothers and sisters in Christ in the nation of Ukraine right now, who are literally afraid for their lives, because at any day a missile could come and could blow up the place where they live with their families. It's scary stuff. It's a scary world that we live in. I'm not saying that there's nothing we should be afraid of. But at the same time, I'm saying that we can't live our entire lives in fear, because we have to trust that God is with us, that God is going to help us, that God's going to see us through whatever we face. And most important of all, that our eternal security is safe with God. No matter what happens to us in this life, God's got the next life taken care of for us. So that is the second lesson we should take away from this passage. The third lesson that we should take away from the passage is this: as disciples, we should be telling everyone about Jesus. As disciples, we should be telling everyone about Jesus. So, in the passage, God says, "This is my son, listen to him." In the passage, Jesus says to the disciples, "Get up, don't be afraid." And then, at the end of the passage, Jesus says to the disciples as they're heading down the mountain, "Hey, what happened here today, guys, don't tell anyone what you've seen." So maybe you're saying, well, Pastor Kerry, you're telling us the opposite of what Jesus said, because you're saying as disciples we should be telling everyone. And Jesus in this passage was saying to the disciples, don't tell anyone. Well, what I'm clarifying for you is that Jesus was saying to the disciples, don't tell anyone what you've seen until, and the until is pretty critical there, until the Messiah has been raised from the dead. And then, of course, we need to tell everyone. And look, friends, I'm sure that many of you watching this, maybe you grew up in churches or in faith communities where there was a lot of pressure placed on you, maybe even a lot of guilt trips about going and evangelizing to everybody and anybody. And friends, that's not my goal. In fact, it's never the way that I've tried to encourage you as a pastor. But at the same time, this is the truth that I live my life by. And if you are a disciple, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, then this is the truth that you live your life by as well. And just like Jesus said a couple of weeks ago, we can't take that light and we can't hide it under a bowl. We need to let our light shine. We need to let people know. We need to tell everyone. So whatever that means for you, God bless you. Whatever that means for me, then hopefully God will continue to use me. But that's what I'm talking about here. And friends, right now, what I'd like to encourage you to do is I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and get your communion elements, and I'll grab mine. And at this time, I would remind you of Jesus' words in the upper room with the disciples when he took the bread and broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And I would remind you of Jesus' words when he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." Let us pray. God, we thank you for the fact that Jesus was and is and always will be the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, the old covenant. We pray that you would help us to go and to let the world know what we believe with all our hearts. Amen. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.